Welcome back to Regulate Tech. You thought we were gone, but we were not. And so with the autumn coming and the general back to school spirit descending on us all, we have decided to go over a number of different issues over the autumn. But the first one we wanted to talk about is what we call Redlines. And Redlines generally has been something that I think we have seen a lot of, haven't we, my friend Richard?
We have indeed, Nicklas. Yeah, so I mean, red lines can be set by governments. You know, this is a thing which they insist that a company does, and if they don't, the company has crossed the red line, and they will be all over them. It can also be something a company does. The company says, "Look, this is something we are not willing to do." When a government asks us, and if the government asks us, then we will refuse under all circumstances, even at risk of legal sanction. And just recently, over the last couple of weeks, we've seen sort of two examples of that breakout into the open, where the CEO of one tech company, Telegram, has been arrested by the French. It's still an ongoing investigation, but the French authorities seem to believe that Telegram and their CEO have crossed one of their red lines. And we've also seen in Brazil, a Supreme Court judge ordering the blocking of the service Twitter X, not taking action against its owner, but taking action against the service because the Brazilian Supreme Court feels that service has crossed their red line in terms of refusing to take down content. And the service has said, no, taking down the content would cross our red line.
But it's different, isn't it? I mean, you have the red lines of a company on one side where they say we're not willing to do this, and then you have the red lines of a country and a democratically elected government on the other side. How can these even compete? And is it just because it's countries that are not necessarily the domicile of the company that this happens, or why are we ending up in this situation? And can a company ever win against the government?
I mean, if CEOs of companies know their clash repertoire, they'll know that the song goes, "I fought the law and the law won." So they do need to be careful, because I think ultimately the law will win. A company is a legal entity; it's got individuals who work for it, and anyway, so somebody sort of works as a politician. I think the law is supreme. But companies certainly can challenge, and yes, they can decide how far they're prepared to take the risks that come with a breaking of the law in a particular country, or a refusal to engage with the authorities in that country. The way in which they do that will certainly depend on their footprint in particular countries, and it's true, Nicklas, to your point, that in the country where a service is domiciled, that's the country where they're least likely to deliberately flout the law, because the curtains are going to come down pretty quickly if they do. As they get further and further away from their home country, they may be willing to take more and more risks. And I think the thing that would be really interesting for us to tease out and think about that for sort of policy professionals out there is how to do this in a sort of thoughtful manner. You can do it by accident. you could just sort of blunder into crossing government's red lines and getting shut down, or you can be very deliberate, and that might still involve being shut down because as a company you're willing to take that risk. But I think there's a way of thinking about this and creating a framework that is squarely in the domain of policy professionals. They're the people who need to advise companies on how to think about these risks and where they're going to hit them.
So let's start with that perspective. You're the head of the policy team. You have a very strong indication that in a certain country, the government has just had it with your service, and they are about to prohibit it unless you're doing something that the founder and the leadership of the company is very unwilling to do. You're sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place. You see the political capital you built up in this country, the sort of credibility you have at play on one side, and on the other side, there's this notion in the company that we just won't do this. We sort of rather prefer to exit the country if those are the conditions. How do you navigate that situation? And how do you deal with the fact that the leadership of the company may not necessarily see the long-term impact of what they're thinking through?
Yeah, and again, I mean, So I think that what you've described is the classic scenario where the only time you really sort of think very hard and deep about your red lines is when you're in that crunch situation. The country has made a request and you need to decide in the moment how you want to respond. And so we can talk about that, but then it would be great to kind of unpick a sort of sensible framework for trying to preempt that situation, because I think it's fairly predictable, and we've been through it, both of us in our own companies, these scenarios. And as I say, I think there are patterns that emerge and there are ways to think about it, understanding your company's values and understanding how governments work. But when you're hit there in the crunch moment, I think the key thing is sort of clarity of communication. It is being able to give really good advice, sound advice that says, look, if we do A, then B is likely to happen. It can be hard if you're talking to engineers. They want you to say how likely is it that B will happen, and you can't give a percentage value always. You could say, if we refuse to comply with this request, there is a good chance that the country will want to shut us down. You can't say it's a 63% chance or an 84% chance. It's just you're making your best estimate. So that's one challenge. But having given that sort of good advice, I think the critical thing is neither to sugarcoat it and neither to sort of say we can just carry on because there's people in the company who want to hear that, nor is it to cry wolf, to say, the sky's going to fall on our heads when it's not, because both of those things will discredit you. So the honest, clear advice about a specific scenario, that is, I think, a primary function of a policy professional working with their legal colleagues. And doing that well, it really is one of the areas of your professional sort of strengths, or should be one of the areas of your professional strengths. Having done that in this kind of reactive in the moment way, I think then the really helpful thing you can do is step back and go, okay, how do we think about this systemically? How do we think about this for all the countries where we operate, so we can get out of this phase of just panicking because government's asked us to do something?
And I think that's important for another reason, which is that although you may be willing to exit from a small, non-economically important country X, your decision to do so is unlikely to be confined to that particular country's policymakers. Other policymakers will see the same, and either they will be deterred or they will be encouraged. And they will say, look, maybe it was just because this small country said that they wouldn't tolerate this behavior. What if we all gang up? And if you think about this in a European Union context, for example, exiting one European Union country is hardly even possible. So if you're thinking about red lines vis-a-vis a member of the European Union, then you had better think about red lines against the European Union as a whole, even though there are some exceptions to that. So, I mean, you have to systemically approach this, which means that you have to have an understanding of the broader situation and where it will lead us. And let's start with something really basic. I mean, we know that as these services, internet services, artificial intelligence, social media services become more popular, some people are going to use them to cause harm, right?
That's right. I mean, it's kind of as night follows day. It's just within the population of any country, there are a certain number of people who will do pretty awful things. And as a service becomes popular, that's going to occur through the service. People will be using that service, not the fault of the service necessarily. But I remember, again, as Facebook grew in the UK, they used to get these headlines going like, Facebook murderer, because somebody who murdered somebody was talking to somebody else on Facebook. Well, you realize at a certain point when most of the population is using your service, yes, of course, all the murderers will be using it, just as all the people sending birthday greetings. So you get to that point where a certain number of the people are doing awful things. Government's primary responsibility is to keep people safe. Governments of all kinds, that is their core function. They have to demonstrate they're trying to keep people safe. And so if your service is somehow implicated in that harmful activity, they're going to come to you and ask you for things. And the two things that they're typically going to ask you for is, information that will help them to identify the people doing the harmful things so they can stop them, and or removal of content or a service feature that is somehow involved in the harm, that the harm is coming because, for example, some content is live on your service. So content and feature removal and data about users are the things typically that governments will come to when they're trying to respond to a harm, as they must do, because that's their core function.
So let's just make it sort of a thought experiment here. You could imagine that when that happens, a government comes and asks for user data or for the removal of content or for access to a service in some unusual way. There is a world in which you as a policy team just say, well, go ahead and give it to them, otherwise it will be a bother. At what points should you advise the company to resist such requests? What are the considerations that go into the equation where you consider them?
Yeah, I mean, again, you'll work closely with your legal colleagues, and this will vary country to country. But I think there are essentially three models for legal compliance, which you can think through as a company. The first is full compliance. Yes, if you essentially say, look, whatever the government is ordering us to do, assuming that the order is well formed legally, then our baseline stance is to never seek to be in breach of one of those orders. And that, as I say, typically is what you do in your headquarters country, because all of those orders are enforceable. So full compliance is state one. State two is partial compliance, where you have looked at it and said, look, orders of this kind we're willing to comply with, orders of that kind we're not. And that would typically not be in your headquarters country because you wouldn't feel you have the discretion. But in other countries, you may say, look, as far as we're concerned from a legal point of view, we're complying voluntarily, and therefore we can pick and choose which bits we want to comply with of your law and which bits we don't. And we can go into how government responds, but that's a very common stance actually for countries outside of a headquarters country. And then the third position is, look, no compliance. We pride ourselves on the fact that we just don't respond to any kind of legal authorities. We don't recognize jurisdiction at all, and our position is just never to respond. So you've got these always respond, never respond, and sometimes respond positions, and a typical company will vary between countries. It's possible a company can say always no or always yes. Those are conceivable positions. More typically, it's somewhere in the middle. It's always yes in home country, sometimes yes in key markets, for example, European Union countries, and perhaps always no in really challenging markets from a human rights perspective. You imagine some of those countries that are completely out with human rights framework, your position may be default no, and you never seek to comply in those countries.
So it's interesting because it also requires that you ask the question, how should a company make these decisions? We talk about the legal analysis, but the legal analysis of the order may be that it requires us to do these things, and there's an interpretation where we could do A, B, C, but there's also an interpretation that allows us to do A, B. But then there has to be some kind of policy decision and some kind of leadership decision on top of this. What are the factors that go into that? How do you decide? Yeah. You mentioned human rights frameworks as one particular aspect here. Another, I suppose, is something as simple as brand, who you are as a company, who you want to be able to say you are, because your users will be watching your willingness to comply as well, right?
Exactly. So I think that there's a second dimension. So there's your position on compliance, and then a second dimension is I would argue, it's something like your political position. And there again, I think there are three different ways that you can sort of position your company. The first is that you essentially are quiet. As a very business focused company will be quiet. It will, whether it's fully complying or partially complying or not complying, it could say, look, our position is we're not going to go out and pick fights with governments or criticize them. We will quietly get on with complying in our home country. We'll quietly get on with responding politely to requests in other countries, sometimes yes, sometimes no, but we're not going to make a big fuss about it. And that's, again, a sustainable position. So the quiet version is one. And I think that's particularly companies that just want to do business and don't particularly, want to sort of position themselves for any cause or with any set of values. The second description I give of a political stance is that the company is challenging of decisions. And again, it can be challenging in all the markets. It can be challenging in its home market. It sees itself as a bastion of free speech. So even if it's home market where it intends to comply with the orders, it still takes the government to court sometimes just to prove it's got free speech. And when it's given orders in countries it doesn't like, it's very challenging. It will push back on those orders and explain why it can't do them. So it's taken a position, values-based position, as you say, often to appeal to its own users, where it's maybe firmly, but with some kind of a real intent around the values that it presents, pushing back on orders, whilst at the same time respecting broadly the authority of the entities that send it requests. And then I think the third position, which perhaps again is even more speaking to the users, is what I would describe as a belligerent position, where the company is, really actively seeking to undermine authorities that send it requests it doesn't like. So it's actively seeking to bring down governments or change laws, really aggressively moving against policymakers in order to try and change the entire landscape. And again, I think that's a different kind of company leadership. That's where the company leadership really wants to shape the market rather than be a sort of mere business playing in the market. So those three positions broadly, business-like leadership will say, let's quietly get on with it, whether we are complying or not. We don't want to make a fuss. A challenging leadership will say, well, look, we've got values. We want everyone to know about that, but we're not disputing the authority of governments to come after us. And the belligerent leadership that will say, have at you. If you send us stuff we don't like, we're going to say that you're illegitimate. We're going to say that you're scoundrels, and we're going to seek to undermine you and make sure that the laws are changed.
How do you think the division between these three useful categories has changed over time? Because one thing that is clear to me is that many times when you talk to critics, they will argue that all companies are necessarily in the quiet bucket because they're profit-maximizing vehicles, and that very clearly seems, both from the inside and outside, not true to me. There are plenty who are both in the challenging and belligerent buckets. But how do you think it has changed over time? If you look back for sort of the 20 years of internet policy to where we are today, and what are the things that are driving those changes in how companies divide over the different stances?
I think in the early days, people were much more belligerent. And we've talked a lot about the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace, which is a belligerent statement against governments. It says, look, governments don't have authority. We, the internet, are different. So I think that early days, the internet was painted itself, or internet services painted themselves as belligerent. Then as they became businesses, I think you're right, they became quieter in many cases, and in some cases so quiet that civil society organizations were prodding at them saying you should be noisier. I think you could look at some specific cases. I mean, the Google right to be forgotten case is quite interesting, where the European Union was trying to push Google to do things that it didn't want to do, to take down true statements about people that the people felt were no longer fresh and relevant and were against European Union law. Google's position was to be very challenging on that. It literally challenged it all the way up to the most senior court in the European Union. And even after the decision was made, and you'll be familiar with this, Nicklas, but Google continued to try and challenge, to shine a spotlight on it. It didn't just quietly say this law is fine. It sought to shine a spotlight on what it regards to be its deficiencies in law. So actually, the European Union is really quite an interesting playground for looking at this for American companies, because they often can't not comply in Europe. They have to comply pretty much fully because the market's too big. At the same time, they do vary, I think, or veer between sometimes quietly complying, but more frequently either challenging or in some cases being belligerent. And American companies will very noisily complain about European Union regulation and seek to get it changed at the same time as complying with it. So I say that I think it does shift around over time, but the broad trend, I think, has been towards more compliance over time, and then the sort of political stance has been oscillating between sometimes being quiet and then sometimes being noisy. And if we look, I mean, one of the current examples we're talking about now, if we look at the Twitter X scenario in Brazil, again, that reflects, I think, in a way, a change of leadership, that that Twitter X has always, I think, offered partial compliance in Brazil, pretty comprehensive compliance. And I think they were mostly quiet, sometimes challenging, but they would work with law enforcement officers in Brazil. Brazil is a very big country and important market. Under more recent leadership, it's decided firstly to challenge through the courts, and then when the courts continue to issue orders it didn't like, it's become belligerent. And over the last few months, you've seen the leadership of the company essentially saying that the Supreme Court justice with whom they have the argument is illegitimate and should be removed from office. Now, you can't get much more belligerent than that. So that's where it sort of shifted. These are interesting scenarios where you've seen a shift over time in the political stance, not necessarily in the underlying compliance, but certainly in the attitude that's being taken.
It seems to me that polarization in society might have enabled some of this reemergence of the belligerent stance, that for some companies it actually pays off to take a more belligerent stance, because what they're doing is that they're at the same time reaffirming their attachment to values back home. It could be values with one group or another in the US. It can be different kinds of values with groups on the internet. And so as we move into an increasingly polarized society, the belligerent stance from companies might actually have a higher payoff for those companies, because they can signal more clearly that they belong to a certain group that they're interested in belonging to. So whilst we may have gone through a quiet phase, we could be re-emerging in a much more belligerent phase. Do you think that's accurate?
I certainly think there's something in that. I mean, society generally has become, or politics has generally become noisier, and yes, the belligerent position is the highest stakes position. It's like all or nothing. You're really going for it. I mean, to be candid, it's never been my first instinct. My first instinct has been generally that if you, I've sat down with people and they've made requests that we had no intention of complying with because we feared they would be contradictory to the human rights of users, but I was quite happy sort of nodding along, leaving the meeting knowing I'm not going to meet you again for another year and there's no way we're going to give you something. So that's the ultimate sort of quiet stance. We listen to you, but we don't do anything. And I felt comfortable with that because the service keeps running, but you haven't compromised the rights of your users. You're right, but nowadays there is, I think, more of an expectation that you should say to the person across the table, no way, bang the table. We're not going to do this thing. You're bad. We're good. I honestly think how this plays out will depend on what happens next. So again, really interesting for us to see and for policy professionals to look at it. If governments end up backing down, then that suggests that the belligerent stance was worth it. If what happens is that the companies end up backing down, having been through all of this, and they've suffered, they've lost their position in the market, and I think that they might be making these assumptions that users are going to flock to them. They're going to be more popular because they resisted government attention. If it turns out actually they're less popular, that's what will tone everything down again. But we've now got some case studies to see what happens. We can watch what happens, and we can come back to this podcast in 6 months' time and see where Twitter X is in Brazil, for example, and how this belligerent stance, which is very public, has played out over that period of time.
So let's make this more complicated. To some degree, it's also a competitive issue. So as you compete with other companies, they have the choice of taking the quiet, the belligerent, or the challenging position vis-a-vis your position, and that can give them certain advantages or disadvantages. We've mostly discussed Western democracies, or at least democracies to some extent, but there's also a lot of countries that have companies that originate in authoritarian countries. So and those typically don't go into challenging and never go into belligerent, because compliance is simply an operational condition that you have to accept if you start out in an authoritarian country. So what does this mean for the overall competitive landscape? That you'll have a whole set of companies that are not challenging nor belligerent, but deeply quiet and compliant. And then you have these American companies that come in and often end up being at least challenging, if not belligerent. Is there something going on here about geopolitical competition as well as corporate decision making?
I think there could be, and Yeah, it will be to see how it plays out. Again, I'll confess my own bias. My own bias tends to be in favour of sort of quiet, partial compliance. I think that a lot of governments can issue requests that are excessive, and the best way to deal with that is you certainly shouldn't comply with them, but it's often best to do that in a sort of polite way rather than poking the bear, and so that's sort of always been my position. You're right. I worry that companies, either because that's their home country tradition or because they've seen what happens to the belligerent companies, end up not discriminating in the same way and just simply say yes to everything that they're asked to do. The trend is certainly going to be towards more compliance as companies' services become more significant in markets. Firstly, they'll get more attention from the authorities because just by sheer dint of numbers, it's more likely that bad things will happen. And secondly, they're more likely to have a real financial and business interest in staying in the country. So we already have a trend that's towards more compliance. What is the trend that holds us back from that? And I think it is only really a cultural trend and a sense of a respect for human rights that people in the companies have, where they don't necessarily want to go screw you to the governments, but they do want to play hard to get where they think it's important. And yes, I do worry to your point that new entrants into the market may not have that same culture. But again, I think it's company by company. You need to look at the leadership, and again, crucially for our profession, you need to look at who they're hiring in the public policy teams, where their leadership is getting advice from, and it's going to be that a combination of legal teams, public policy teams, comms and reputational teams, and the leadership, with the business leadership probably the most important in that, who are going to define the stance. And one that is simply, look, if government says jump, we say how high. Even as a policymaker, I don't think that's particularly healthy. I think there's some kind of dynamic tension that's really the optimal place to be in.
So you want to end up in quiet to challenging, partial compliance. That's the place at which you also create the kind of friction that helps society decide where it wants to go. Because if you just comply and lay down and die, then obviously you're creating no friction whatsoever, and you're not creating any impetus for the government to re-examine its premises as to why they're asking these questions or asking for this data, right?
Yeah, it should be an informed debate. And again, some people are like, it's all or nothing. I find that really frustrating. It is perfectly possible to have a strong set of moral values and say, look, this law enforcement agency I'm dealing with in this country, those are serious professionals investigating serious threats to individuals. And if I work with them, I'm acting in the interest of human rights because I'm going to stop people being harmed in some way. At the same time, these other people, maybe in the same country, are political actors who are just trying to suppress opposition speech. And with them, I'm going to politely but firmly frustrate their requests. I'm not going to work with them in the same way. I think that's a perfectly reasonable position to hold. You don't need to say yes all the time or no all the time. And putting that extra friction in where the friction is due, I actually think is helpful from a human rights and individual user perspective, probably helpful to the government because governments can overreach and then regret it. And they might not feel this, but it can be actually quite a helpful tension for them. But what you shouldn't do is allow that need to put friction in one place bleed over so that you end up putting in friction in the way of law enforcement agencies who are doing the job I think we all as citizens want, which is catching really bad people when they're doing really bad things.
I want to call out that the model you have of a company here is very specific and also very different from like the traditional standard model of a companies that we meet in much of the policy debate. The standard model is that a company is a profit maximizing vehicle. Every decision can be explained by what gives most profit to the company. What you have suggested is that there's a whole set of stances here, the challenging, non-compliant, quiet stance that does incur cost for the company over time, but it's a cost the company is willing to carry, not because it generates profit in the long term, but because it's something like the right thing to do. A lot of people don't think that's true. They think that companies can't have values. They can't have, they can't engage in any moral decision making. So how would you explain to them that what are the sources of those morals and the sources of those decisions in companies that keep companies from just defaulting to maximizing their profits?
Yeah, this is such an important point because sometimes the decisions are confused either externally when people are judging a company, or even internally when people are trying to make decisions. So you're right. So you might get to a point where there is a risk that you're going to be shut down in a country, so your service will become unavailable. The profit maximizing view of the world will say, well, we just need to stay open, whatever. And therefore we'll say yes to the government just to stay open to make money. The human rights focused view might still say we want to stay open, might still lead you to comply with a particular government request, but it's doing it for a very different reason. It's doing it because you've determined that restricting the speech, for example, of 10 users is a price worth paying in order to keep your platform available for another 10 million users. And your working assumption is the 10 users whose speech is restricted can just come back on as long as the platform's available. So you come to the same conclusion, which is perhaps restrict the speech to keep your service up. You're doing it for very different reasons. And I think that's really important that you are able to talk about that and discuss why you're doing what you're doing, in a way where the assumption isn't just, well, you only did it to make money. And how you get there, I think, is, again, it's for the company leadership. The company leadership needs to say, we only care about the money side, that's fine. In which case, don't dress it up as a human rights-based decision. Or if the company leadership says, we want to be as respectful of human rights as possible, these are the ones we care about, and this is the way that we would like you to make those decisions, so please give advice on this basis. I don't think there's any other way. It's about the individuals that work in that company, ultimately, those who have been hired and those who have been put in positions of authority.
Yes, and they do actually. Sometimes they are not perfect profit maximizing machines, which is sometimes obscured by the public debate. They make good decisions and bad decisions, but they make them on a plethora of different grounds that are carefully examined in different ways, I think. Which may be the one thing that I believe that most people will disagree with me about. I want to end on a sort of a prediction note. So we've seen now in Brazil that Twitter is blocked. VPN access to Twitter is fined by, I think, $800 or the equivalent per day. And there's a lot of pressure, including political pressure, on the court system, which is interesting because this is a government that's sort of now fighting with itself to lift the ban. So if you had to predict, next time we're sitting down or, in the next 3 months or so, do you think Twitter will be available again in Brazil, or do you think that the ban will stick?
Yeah, I think it is most likely it will be available. The most likely outcome seems to be it will be available because the platform will find some way of complying with some court orders in Brazil. So I think that's the fundamental piece. And I think they're both in a position today where neither would feel comfortable backing down. Twitter would say, we can't back down as long as you're ordering us to remove content where we disagree with the removal. And the court says, it's not for you. If we've ordered the removal, having considered all the facts, who the hell are you to defy that? I think most likely they will come to some agreement where both sides have to compromise. And it's the classic way out of these scenarios. I think if Twitter continues to say, look, we're just going to reject Brazilian, they could escalate further. We're going to reject all Brazilian court orders. I don't think they will be back under those circumstances. But I would have to say that in most cases, what we've seen is companies are willing to come into more compliance, having made their point. But Twitter X is unpredictable these days, and maybe they're the ones that will sort of seek to hold out and refuse to give any grounds. In which case, I say I don't know how the Brazilian authorities can concede if Twitter X is not giving them something.
And I think that giving them something is again going to land in the laps of the policy professionals. The thing that you have to do in this situation is to assign a method to save face. and make sure that the decisions that were made by the authorities involved can be changed because they can point to new circumstances. I'm thinking on, for example, when I think it was OpenAI was blocked in Italy by the Garante for the data protection reasons, and it didn't last that long. But what happened was that there was a package introduced by OpenAI that contained different kinds of privacy measures, which allowed the Garante to then move back from their decision, even though if you read the decision, it was quite general and not necessarily targeted just as the measures were taken. So, as a poll professional, one of the many skills you have to acquire is the ability to design face-saving actions on the top of red lines being crossed. So at some future point, we should talk about how do you walk back once all of the red lines have been crossed by all of the involved parties.
Yes, and I mean that's that's an issue for politics writ large, isn't it? This is sort of generic negotiating piece as well. But I think you're right to put your finger on that as being the really hard issue. But ultimately, that has to happen. And again, I think we see that the other one I'm thinking of now is I think YouTube was blocked for years in Turkey, wasn't it, over refusal to remove content. Eventually, some face-saving position was arrived. I think not least because of political change. So that's the other thing, and maybe that will be the Brazil situation. You wait for political change is the other option. But
yes, tricky issues, and that concludes the session on Redline. Something I'm sure we'll come back to, and we'll be able to follow up on what our predictions actually ended up telling us about the world. Thank you so much for listening. You're listening to me, Nicklas Berild Lundblad, asking the questions, and
to me, Richard Allan.
Perfect. Thank you.